Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Africa's Youth Voices. This morning, we are calling you live from the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. This is our Twitter, our X, formerly Twitter, Spaces event. Today's theme is going to be on finance and its means of implementation. The Africa's Youth Voices series is an initiative of the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. We are going to have 3 series with the main objective of pegging the conversation with young people from Africa around key United Nations moments. For this year, the key United Nations moment that we are focusing on will be the Sustainable Development Goals Summit, organized at headquarters during the month of September. We are going to develop on 4 themes. Therefore, we will be organizing Africa's Youth Voices X Spaces series across the 4 weeks of September. And our focus for today is going to be once again on finance and development, on the theme of Africa's financing for development, the need to shift the paradigm. We will go over the other 3 upcoming themes after an introduction by Undersecretary General and United Nations Special Advisor on Africa, Cristina Duarte, whom we have the pleasure of speaking with today. She is joining us live from Nairobi, Kenya, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the USG. USG Duarte, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, to have the possibility, the opportunity to have this conversation with the African youth. As my colleague Rado mentioned, we created this stage. OSA created this stage to give an opportunity to young voices to discuss, to participate in the discussion about the assessment in terms of SDG implementation in Africa. As you know, we reached the midpoint in terms of SDG implementation, in terms of the implementation of 2030 agenda. And when assessing or when undertaking this midterm point, we realize that Africa not only but also is off track. I do believe that we need to use the month of September not only to understand the root causes, the reasons why Africa is off track. And of course, today's theme, not by chance, but intentionally, it is the need to shift the paradigm of financing for development in Africa. Because we strongly believe if you want, in the next 15 years, change the pace of Africa's development, we need to put into motion financing for development as a game changer. And you have been advocating that we need to change from a financing for development that in the past 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, have been externally driven to a financing for development that needs to be internally driven. What does that mean? Driven by Africans, driven by African countries. As we speak, everybody believes or everybody has the perception that Africa is financed by outsiders. It's not true. As we speak, Africa already finances its own development in more than 75%. We are already financing our own development in more than 75%. And the numbers are $900 billion, our own financing, against more than $150 billion external flows. And this is an important starting point because we need to change our mindset. We need to stop, reset, and in the process of resetting, we need to say to ourselves that we already finance our own development. And this is the starting point of shifting the paradigm of financing for development from an external driven perception to an internal driven perception. And this is the reason that me and my team have been advocating that it's time to give a primacy role to domestic resource mobilization in Africa. Africa, as we speak, loses on an annual basis $500 billion. Allow me to repeat this number. Africa loses on an annual basis $500 billion. Only in illicit financial flows, Africa loses $88 billion, which means that by the end of today, only considering illicit financial flows, Africa will lose $246 million only today, meaning that Africa has the capacity to generate flows. Africa has the capacity to generate economic flows and financial flows, because we cannot lose something that we don't have. The problem of Africa is, what should we do not to lose the $500 billion that we prove that we are able to generate? So if Africa is able to generate, but is not able to mobilize, to keep these $500 billion and invest in its own development. And what is missing piece? Strong institutions, effective states that create conducive environments for that to happen. This is the reason that we decided, me and my team, in these September youth stages, to start by debating financing for development and the need to shift the paradigm. Because as a continent, we already produce $500 billion, we need to mobilize them in terms of financing our own development. Just to provide a second figure, if we compare these $500 billion that we lose on an annual basis with Africa's debt stock in 2021, for example, $644 billion, you realize that Africa loses on an annual basis more or less the amount of our stock in terms of public debt. So this means that at the end of the day, our debt stock could be addressed by addressing the huge amount of money that Africa loses on an annual basis. So this is the numbers that I would like just to throw on our tables, on our desks, on our minds, and to promote a very powerful discussion, open discussion about the shift or the need to shift the paradigm of financing for development in Africa. Back to you, Rado.
Thank you so much, USG. Dear participants, dear speakers, you have heard from Undersecretary General Cristina Duarte, who is the Special Advisor of United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Africa. She has been very clear on the theme we are going to discuss today. And this discussion, that introduction from USG Duarte, also gives us an idea of the conversation that we are going to engage in today. This week's session will lead to another session next week where we will talk about energy and climate with a focus on Africa's readiness to manage the trade-offs. And as USG Duarte mentioned, we will also focus on other issues impacting Africa's development throughout the month of September. So our third session will be on digitalization, unleashing Africa's growth through the Great Enabler, and that will be on the 19th of September. And the fourth and last session will be focused on people-centered policies, which is an imperative toward Africa's development. That will follow on the 26th of September. More details about these upcoming sessions will be provided at the end of today's connection by my colleague Lebo Disway, who is also our co-host today. Good morning, Lebo. And without further ado, I will give the floor to our moderator, Ray Kiliho. Once again, USG Duarte, thank you very much. We wish you a fruitful exchange in Nairobi, Kenya, and we thank you once again for finding the time to brief us today. Thank you, USG.
Thank you, Rado. A pleasure, as always.
Over to you, Ray.
Thank you so much, Rado, and indeed tremendous appreciations to Undersecretary General, Her Excellency Duarte, for really setting the scene for our conversation and for reiterating the issues that Africa constantly faces. Now, to just build on that, I wish to add a little bit of context to it. Now, African countries have made progress in mobilizing financial resources for their development, as just highlighted by the Undersecretary General. Now, resources from domestic mobilization only account for two-thirds of the continental's total financial resource and have further potential to drive Africa's financing for development. Now, the pandemic has also brought the vulnerabilities of African economies to external shock, including narrowing production, limiting diversification, and also to heavily dependence on global trade and finance, a shallow financial sector, and leading to high levels of inequality and poverty. Now, several long-standing issues have hampered Africa's development, has slowed mobilization of domestic public resources through increased tax revenues, not enough expenditure, leveraging on private financial resources, and possibility of looking into mobilizing savings. There is a need indeed to shift the paradigm. I have the pleasure of having with us today four great panelists, young people from across Africa, who would be sharing some of the extents into this conversation. Without further ado, I wish to briefly introduce Erasmus. Erasmus is a distinguished experience in the telecom and digital payment financial industry, and also he is an innovator in the fintech-based industry and fintech innovation sector in Uganda. With us as well, Davis Grant, who has enormous experience and expertise across policy advocacy, development, entrepreneurship, financial services, risk management, name it all, and also further experience in climate finance. He's worked in various capacities, including supporting financial inclusion. Also with us is Ms. Rowan, who is a member of Young Economists Network of the Economic Commission for Africa, and also a fellow of the Pan-African Green Leaders Academy. Also with us, another great panelist, Ms. Zipporah from Kenya, who is a focal point of Sub-Saharan Africa Children and Youth Constituency for Sustainable Economies. Now, to start off, I want to hand off to Erasmus. I want to really remind us, like 7 years now to 2030, the world in Africa in particular is off track, as we've heard from the Undersecretary General, to achieve global goals by 2030. Now, according to African Union's own analysis, progress toward achieving the SDG is slow and needs revisiting. What could be one or two major underlying causes of this tagging progress? Over to you, Erasmus, for your insights. So perhaps I think he's having a bit of a challenge. Perhaps I might want to direct the attention to Davis. Davis, if you're in position to intervene, kindly would you share what could be underlying cause of Africa's staggering progress? Davis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ray. If you can just confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, can hear you loud and clear.
So thanks, Ray. I think this is such a great conversation to have, and I think it's such a poignant conversation to have because of where we are, right? 7 years to 2030, and indeed, we have definitely seen that progress made towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course, the Agenda 2063 has definitely slowed, and in some cases has regressed. And some of those reasons have got to do with some of the major challenges that exist or socioeconomic issues that exist today. So one of them obviously being the lingering impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic. Because what we saw is it was not really the direct effects of the pandemic, but rather the indirect effects of the pandemic as it pertains to value chains, as it pertains to disruption in terms of health, etc. All of these components together have resulted in a slowing down of economic activity and a depleting of public resources, right? And so invariably what we have seen is that, in fact, across most of the SDGs, we have seen a significant deterioration in terms of progress made. I think a study that I did read only really made reference to progress that we've made around SDG 12, 13, and 14. But all the others, we've actually gone backwards as a result of some of these things. Further, also is understanding the fact that the Russia-Ukraine crisis has a major effect on world markets. We know that, for example, a lot of grain, etc., has typically would have been imported by African countries from Russia and Ukraine and from that region. And given the disruptive nature of the conflict that we can see has resulted in increased inflation, etc. And that's really impacted, obviously, the continent that is particularly sensitive to these challenges. And of course, if we look at it in a global context, what we're all seeing is, as a result of some of these geodynamic shifts and socioeconomic challenges, is also almost like a deglobalization that has happened. And what that has resulted is a significant impact to African countries. And we've seen that in many African countries, actually, and I think USG Joate spoke to that, have seen an escalation in their public debt, etc. And of course, in tandem with the fact that institutions on the continent are not as robust, even before the pandemic and these recent challenges, it's just now impacted and accelerated a challenge. And it's kind of put us in a situation today that has made us revisit this conversation in a very urgent fashion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Viz, for really sharing that context. I want to now head on next to Rowan. Rowan, in your perspective, what could be one underlying cause of Africa's staggering progress? Rowan, if you can unmute your mic, over to you.
Hello, Ray. Hello, everyone. There are several underlying causes that could be contributing to the slow progress in achieving the SDGs in Africa. My colleague has mentioned one, that is the impact of crisis on achieving development, especially the sustainable one. Second, in my opinion, is the lack of adequate financing. In my opinion, it's one of the key factors that could be contributing to the slow progress in achieving SDGs in Africa. Many African countries that face significant challenges in mobilizing the resources needed to finance and implementing the SDGs. These include both domestic and external financing. The domestic one, mobilization, is often hindered by weak tax systems, limited physical space, and low levels of private sector investment. External financing is often tied to conditions that may not align with the SDGs and is subject to unpredictability. I think you mentioned to one cause only, or can I continue?
We might come back to that in a bit. Thank you so much for really shedding some light into that. Would be great to hear from our colleagues, Zipporah. Zipporah really works with the young people, and sustainability is really key. Zipporah, what would you say is one underlying challenge to staggering Africa's development in this aspect? Over to you, Zipporah.
Thank you, Ray. And just to confirm, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. I'm very glad that we are having this conversation as the Climate Africa Summit is going on, because the theme around finance is very key to the summit and to the regional climate weights. So for me, I want to stress on something, because the conversation around restructuring the global financial ecosystem has already started. And I think that is one of the key hindrances that is staggering the growth of Africa and achievement of the SDGs. So during this conversation, there's one culprit that I feel that it is left behind when you are talking about restructuring the global financial ecosystem, and it is the international credit rating system. This is an oligopolistic market structure that is dominated by three private companies that determine the sovereign worthiness of the sovereign ratings of countries. Three private companies. That bugs me the wrong way. And for their sins, I need to mention them by name. This is the S&P Global, Moody's, and Fitch. These three companies have made access to finance expensive for Africa, which is not the inherent biases are there. We cannot say they were created in it, but they have come up as time progresses due to their business model. They have a very peculiar business model where the borrower pays and this breeds a conflict of interest, and because the paying clients they fear the paying clients will go away if they downgrade them. So African countries and developing countries have really suffered from negative credit ratings from these three companies. And my point is we need to relook at the international credit rating system as we look at the grand conversation around restructuring the global financial ecosystem. Thank you, Ray. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Zipporah. So perhaps raises a more interesting exploration into the matter, into how Africa be able to really unleash its potential. Before we head out to the next part of the discussion, I would like to also hear from Erasmus Fuda. Erasmus, what would be the underlying cause of Africa's staggering progress? If you're capable, please take the floor. Somehow, my colleague Erasmus is facing technical challenges. We'll come back to him in a bit. So I want to head on next to the second part of the conversation. And before I come to Davis, I just wanted to perhaps okay, thank you, Zipporah. So perhaps raises a more interesting exploration into the matter, into how Africa be able to really unleash its potential. So I want to head on next to the second part of the conversation. And before I come to Davis, I just wanted to really remind ourselves, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres highlighted during his remarks at the High-Level Political Forum that the annual Sustainable Development Goals funding gap has risen from $2.5 trillion from before the pandemic to an estimated $4.2 trillion. Now, governments are drawn in debt, with developing countries facing sky-high borrowing costs, and 52 nations are in a default or close to it. With no effective system of debt relief in sight, what does this mean for Africa in scope of attaining SDGs by 2050? Davis, would you want to shed some light into that?
Sure, thanks, Ray. Look, I think at the onset, we must recognize that as an immediate issue, if we are not able to address the financing required to be able to invest in the various actions and initiatives in order to attain the SDGs, we may not be able to attain the SDGs in the timelines that we had put in place. What does actually mean in context, right? So it means a couple of things. So it means one is, as a continent, we have to be even more aware around or investigate more innovative opportunities for mobilizing funding. And I think USG Duarte obviously mentioned that earlier in her opening statement. I do think it's really critical that we have to think about how do we foster a culture that holds collectively our governments and institutions accountable. One, to improving our institutional landscape. And then two is ensuring that there's effective transparency in place so that the funding that is generated is used for the purposes that it's intended. Because what we're finding, and particularly on the continent, is that where young people are disproportionately impacted socioeconomic issues that we face. When we think of migration, when we think of, for example, health issues, when we think of unemployment, right? Young people are the ones that are particularly impacted. And so if we don't solve for these financing challenges, we run the risk of a couple of things. Beyond just the failure of achieving the SDGs and a kind of the Africa we want, we also run the risk of instability. We have already seen, for example, in many regions of the continent, where young people's interests have not been taken into account, that they will, by virtue of their demand for better access, their demand for better accountability from governments, we see that they are driving change. And so if we are not able to deal with this issue of financing and therefore the achievement of the SDGs, we run the risk of, one, really losing out on this demographic dividend that Africa is supposed to have. Africa is supposed to have the youngest population by 2050, etc. We lose the ability to take advantage of the benefits that come. And instead, what we find ourselves is we're heading towards a situation where further social unrest and instability then become the norm in society. Because if we, as young people, are unemployed, don't have access to healthcare, etc., and basic rights, I don't believe that young people will just sit back and just accept that. So I think for me, it's fundamental when we think about long-term development to always think about the three aspects of sustainability. One is from an environmental perspective, the second from an economic perspective, but thirdly also from a social perspective. So we risk, obviously, not actually achieving sustainable development because one of the keys to sustainable development is peace and security. These are some of the things that then become impacted when we are unable to provide for Africans. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Davis. I mean, that's very elemental. The three aspects of sustainability, environmental, economic, and social. And I want to head on next to Rowan. So after hearing such impediments, holding Africa's development and staggering, for a couple of, holding systems accountable, the capability to not only mobilize resources, but to be able to hold resources. So looking into this, Rowan, what kind of forms will be required to expand domestic resource mobilization? To enhance efficiency, perhaps in public expenditure? Maybe such inefficiencies in public expenditure, including in health, education, and infrastructure, cost Africa an equivalent of 2% of the GDP. What kind of reforms do you think Africa needs to really be able to expand the base of domestic resource mobilization? Rowan, over to you.
Well, Ray, thank you. Expanding domestic resource mobilization will require a range of reforms for me to increase revenue collection, improving tax administration, and reducing tax evasion and avoidance. In my opinion, they are the key reforms that could be implemented to expand domestic resource mobilization. We can take more details about these three factors. To improving tax policy, these involve review and revising tax policies to ensure that they are aligned with the national development goals and don't represent a burden sectors of the economy or the population. This could include reducing tax exemption and increasing tax rates on the luxury goods and services. Second factor, strengthening tax administration. This may involve the capacity of tax authorities to effectively and efficiently collect taxes. This could include investing in technology and the human resources to improve tax administration process and implementing risk-based approaches to tax compliance. Finally, reducing tax evasion and avoidance. This may involve implementing measures to prevent tax evasion and avoidance, such as increasing penalties for non-compliance, improving information exchange between tax authorities, and implementing measures to reduce the financial the lack of financial flows. But let me confirm that or underline that in addition to expanding domestic resource mobilization, enhancing efficiency in public expenditure will require aimed at improving budget planning and execution, reducing waste and inefficiencies. And these are some of the key reforms also can be implemented to enhance efficiency in public expenditure. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. I really find it interesting the way that the conversation really focuses on really Africa's own inability to really be effective into how we account for domestic resources that's available, but also the flows into the capacities of administration of resources in countries, including tax revenues. And I want to now head on next to Zipporah to really get a reflection and on this interlinkage between finance, sustainable development goals, and young people. So, what lessons, Zipporah, can be learned from youth-led initiatives in other regions of the world that have perhaps effectively harnessed financial resources to drive a sustainable development goals attainment? I mean, what is Africa missing? Zipporah, over to you.
Thank you, Ray. I think as much as we have similar problems with other parts of the world that have been able to harness financial resources, our problems are unique to Africa. So Africa needs to charter its own waters in building a sustainability path to low carbon economies and not benchmark on other parts of the world, because we're not working from the same baseline. As advanced economies are talking about transitioning to low carbon society, our needs is different. So we cannot just and base solutions from other parts of the world. We need to chart our own waters and build our own paths to sustainability. What I think is missing from Africa is an African-led narrative on financing models. The time when funding institutions, donors, philanthropies used to come and diagnose our needs, prescribe solutions, and also dictate the terms of Africa we want our needs. Thank you, Ray.
So thank you so much for really shedding that light. Africa needs to really charter its own solutions on its own unique experience and benchmarking from Africa's own benchmark. I think that really resonates in a way to how this combined approaches could really be affected. So I want to try back my colleague Erasmus. Erasmus, I just want to test if we have your technical issue fixed. Can you access your mic? Can you hear me?
Yes, right. I can access now.
Super. So two things onto you, Erasmus. Number one is, what do you think is the just one challenge that Africa faces to its tagging, progress in attaining SDGs? And a follow-up question over that is, in your view, I mean, what priorities should African countries put in place to identify waste and potential savings in their domestic budgets? Over to you, Erasmus.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, all listeners. Erasmus Okot is my name. And Ray, I think we can't ignore the fact that the goals are interconnected.
Right, thank you. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for really shedding that light. Africa needs to really charter its own solutions on its own unique experience and benchmarking from Africa's own benchmark. I think that really resonates in a way to how this combined approaches could really be affected. So I want to try back my colleague Erasmus. Erasmus, I just want to test if we have your technical issue fixed. Can you access your mic? Can you hear me?
Yes, right. I can access now.
Super. So two things onto you, Erasmus. Number one is, what do you think is the just one challenge that Africa faces to its tagging, progress in attaining SDGs? And a follow-up question over that is, in your view, I mean, what priorities should African countries put in place to identify waste and potential savings in their domestic budgets? Over to you, Erasmus.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, all listeners. Erasmus Sakurt is my name. And Ray, I think we can't ignore the fact that the goals are interconnected, and progress in one area can definitely help to achieve progress in others. And being an African, and at least I've also gotten the opportunity to even move cross border. The SDGs have been adopted by every country around the world, but always in Africa towards achieving them has been mixed up. And to my own view, and also little reading that I've been conducting for the past 4 or 5 years, and also that is definitely why we had to come up with a fintech company, Paytota, was mainly to address and see how do we participate in ensuring that we realize some of these SDGs. And the first one, which is definitely now, I think one of the colleagues even raised it, is we cannot ignore a major ecological factor into implementing these SDGs, and environmental challenges that we've seen across the continent and even outside the continent. We are looking at deforestation, which has happened rapidly, even in East Africa, desertification and high carbon footprints, which were not ready when the SDGs were being drafted, and significant obstacles to implementing this in Africa. We've also realized that many African countries are highly investing in fossil fuels and disposable plastics. And again, I must say a few African countries have been able to put at least a ban on this. Of course, we are looking at Kenya and Rwanda. I'm sure if you're to travel in any of those countries, you will actually see if you're using Kenyan Airways, you'll get a notification there's a ban on it. And I think if all the African countries are able to adopt this, then we'll definitely see at least we are able to address that SDG when it comes to climate. And then in terms of the second question, I think that you addressed in terms of savings and domestic budgets. We also must appreciate that boosting domestic savings in Africa, we have to invest more, and this means countries must tap into new assets. And looking at East Africa, and particularly Uganda, where I am based, most of the regular banks only cater for, say, a small percentage. Research sometimes shows a fifth of all Africans. But just think of where we are now able to improve our diaspora investments into our countries. If you look at all the reports by World Bank, and you're able to see how much of the influence is actually coming into our country. But at the same time, how can we tap into a vast pool of financial resources outside the formal banking system? More money will be available for investment, and and this is where the digital payments comes in and the financial comes in, and see how do we create a new market for us to increase this influence, and also in terms of changing our policies.
Thank you.
I think that is it. But maybe if you allow me also to say in terms of the ineffective tax incentives, and again, I would want to borrow from my own country and also East Africa, where at least I've been able to live. A serious disadvantage we've always seen with some of these tax incentives, whenever we are attracting investment, is that at the extent of the enterprises, whenever they want the taxes, the revenue is definitely lost without corresponding benefit to the host country. And we've seen costs can be, in theory, be reduced by means, and also can be found to be targeting some of these incentives. Countries have employed a number of techniques to achieve this, but we are seeing it's still something that is affecting innovation. It is something where we are losing more even when we think we've actually received most of the investment. And we definitely believe there's going to be change in terms of policies. And it's something that we believe if all the regulatory bodies can actually come together and see that we can address this, and not only in education, not only in manufacturing, not only in promotion zones, but I think there's need for us to go deeper and also measure the success in terms of these incentives that are being given to investors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erasmus. I think you really touched on some really elemental points there. You touched an issue about policy harmonization. You touched on issues around boosting savings. Really calls for more investment. Also, the look at effective tax incentives. But you also touched on looking into the diaspora investment, which brings me on to my next question to you. That we are further witnessing that the relative importance of official development assistance in Africa's fund has diminished over the years as private external financial resources, including FDIs, the foreign direct investment, debt, bond flows, remittances, play an increased role in Africa's sustainable development. And closing the financing gap, which has widened because of the COVID pandemic, the Ukraine war, and also multiple crises in Africa. So the disparity in FDI flows between Africa and other regions, and then among African countries, highlights the need to address the challenges limiting investment in the continent. Now, what causes such disparity in foreign direct investment flows? What could be done? Erasmus, over to you.
Thank you, Ray. And I think I will be able to summarize that. And for the fact, in most of our African countries, we cannot ignore whatever we see on media, even what we encounter on a personal level whenever we are accessing some of these services and investment. And almost on a daily basis, you will hear about the rampant corruption. It can be in Uganda, it can be in Kenya, it can be in any country. And factors like political and microeconomic instability definitely have got a negative impact on the FDIs in any country in Africa, which we've always seen is still a very weak infrastructure, poor governance. And I believe if we are to do check out of 10, how many countries at least have improved in terms of their governance? Again, there are very few, and this is affecting almost in terms of the inflows. We are seeing during the pandemic when the diaspora inflows reduced, but also we are looking at the regulatory environment. If you see where I am based, and I think in general in Africa, we are looking at Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria as always the top three. And of course, now Egypt is also coming in. But why is it that the case? It's always about the regulatory environment, which has allowed the inflows to come in, even when the market is definitely not as low as compared, say, for instance, to Uganda, which is picking up in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And I believe all these factors contribute to a slow pickup in terms of the FDI, and also it is contributing to lack of trust in some of the African countries. And we need to come up with strategies. How can you promote those strategies to see that we are able to strengthen our governance structure? And I know we could only be looking at the government, but even us in the private sector, we do receive some of these FDIs for any project that we could be either third parties we are implementing. And what is our governance structure, which we've seen, it is always something that is affecting not only in the government, but even us in the finance, the startup, in the startup space. And this is something I would say, even us as Paytota, we had to take the initiative to see how do we play and ensure that even as we are addressing the SDGs, can we have a very robust governance structure that is able to deal and position us to realize our vision and to then execute our mission. So I would say those factors definitely play a very key role in terms of declined investments into most of the African markets. And I believe if we are able to again go back and check and come up with new strategies, new policies, and see that everyone strengthens their structure, I believe it will be able to pick up, and Africa will be a very conducive place, not even with a foreign, but even us locally. We should be able to promote that. Thank you.
No, this is great. Thank you so much for really sharing that. And before I head on to our next speaker, I just want to remind our listeners, our audience, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, in the meantime, kindly please utilize the chat. Put in the question on the chat, and then my colleagues will be able to follow and perhaps give you an opportunity later to really intervene if you wish to contribute or ask anything. And thank you so much, Erasmus. Now I want to slightly come on Zipporah. Youth are the majority citizens on the continent. I mean, over 60% of the Africa's continent is under the age of 30, per se. Now, what is the role of youths in enhancing the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals? What is the rate of involvement of access to financial resources? What should be happening to address this? Zipporah, over to you.
Thank you, Ray. Yes, of course, the youth are the majority of the demographics in Africa. And to echo sentiment that is coming out from the Africa Climate Summit is we are the greatest resource this continent has. And it is, I think we can all agree that the CSOs, the youth CSOs from the grassroots level to the high level, the us who we engage with the UN, we have played a very key role in the popularization of the SDGs. So halfway through, we have made them popular all the way to the grassroots level. And now we need to move to implementation. And this is where the issue of the climate access finance is coming in. And there's this popular sentiment that there is money in this climate action finance. There's money. And then when youth, because when they try to access this funding, because you find that the financial structure as it is today is not youth friendly. You try to access these funds and you find that it's not accessible, and that's the end of story. So in terms of accessibility, I would say that it's very, very inaccessible at the moment, and the conversation is ongoing on how to make climate finance accessible. Your second question was what should be happening to address this question? I think it's fair to say I do not have a blueprint on how to solve this problem. It's a humongous problem, but I can suggest two solutions. One is engage more with the carbon markets, because that is where the new money is going. And my grandmother at the village will never know what are carbon credits, what is the carbon markets, and may never even benefit from it. So as the youth of Africa, we need to tap into carbon markets, especially the voluntary sector of the carbon markets, and also tap into financial technology. And I think Erasmus mentioned it. And this is where we can do something like crowdfunding, have coins that are backed by, because Africa is an resources rich continent. And so if we could have coins, the like of Bitcoin and the others, that we do not know what backs them, and in our case, we'll have coins that are backed by our natural resources, I think we can have a very good access to finance that will enable climate action further. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you, Zipporah. And I think you really raise a great point. The role of youth in, appropriating sustainable development goals have been very eminent. And really the function, technology, operation of such, crowdfunding, and also the flow of, climate finance, issues of carbon credit. I think you really raise a great point. The role of youth in, appropriating sustainable development goals have been very eminent. And really the function, technology, operation of such, crowdfunding, and also the flow of, climate finance, issues of carbon credit. I think it's really elemental. We build capacity and awareness to be really able to capitalize on that. Now, before I allow the floor to intervene, questions and contributions, I wanted to quickly touch on with Davis. So we explore the unfortunate situation where Africa loses over $50 billion a year in illicit financial flows. Now, these flows relate principally to commercial transactions, tax evasion, criminal activities like money laundering and drug, arms, and human trafficking, bribery, corruption, and abuse of office, which comes in hugely. What should African states do to stem illicit financial flows? Over to you, Davis.
Thanks, Ray. I think we can't overemphasize the unemployment situation, right? It's really significant. And I think the numbers that USG George shared with us in the beginning of this call are quite telling in terms of the extent of the problem that we face when we consider illicit financial flows. Because to your point, there's many ways in which these flows come up. So the question really is, what should African states do to stem illicit financial flows? Now, I think what's important is about understanding that, and I think my colleague Erasmus alluded to it, good institutions are paramount to achieving progress. And so it's important and incumbent on African states to ensure that they have a more transparent way of reflecting how they use taxpayer or tax revenues, in the execution of their day-to-day activities. Because one of the components around, increasing or having greater access to financial flows is we talk about, for example, how do we bring the informal sector in? The informal sector does not trust that government will do the right thing. And so, for example, we need to think about things like, for example, how do we protect whistleblowers? So these are people who are both in the public, private sector. These are people in civil society who may identify in areas where tax evasion or criminal activity is taking place, bribery, corruption. And so we must protect those people. And African states need to put in measures and policies that do that effectively. Because what that then does is encourages a collective action against combating illicit financial flows. The other thing for me that's really critical is around creating policies that effectively disincentivize people from undertaking things like tax evasion, etc. Part of that is things like how do we, my colleague earlier mentioned about capacitating your tax collection authorities, etc. Because without doing those things, you run the risk, therefore, of people being able to kind of siphon money out of the continent. And this we've seen, obviously, many, many years where this has happened. The other thing that I think is really critical when we think about, what do we need to do to tackle financial flows is also thinking about it from the context of saying that we've got to stop and ensure that as member states or as African states, we build the capacity to hold people accountable through enforcing and effective prosecutions. Because what we find, for example, is, and we see this quite often, is you'll find someone is arrested today for corruption. Tomorrow they appear in court, and then they pay bail, and then thereafter almost nothing happens. So we don't get to the point where people are actually convicted of crimes and the enforcement of these crimes. And so what happens is that people then continue to stay in their positions of power, continue to abuse those things, and effectively we just continue the cycle. So to recap, therefore, we need to protect our whistleblowers. We need to ensure we've got concrete policies that disincentivize illicit flows and things like money laundering controls, anti-bribery, etc. And we also then need to ensure that we are creating capacity to hold in the right place that the culprits can then be brought to account. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you so much, Davis, for your intervention and for shedding some recommendations on what we may be able to do. Now, we have a question from the chat, and my colleagues will guide me if we have any outstanding colleagues on a queue who would wish to really intervene. And so the question from one of our colleagues on the chat is asking, what if the West decides to shut access to finance to Africans? What's the way forward for us? I want to invite any of the panelists, perhaps, to really shed some light onto that. And I would give this opportunity to Zipporah. I know you want to run. Zipporah, just briefly, what if the West decides to shut access to finance to Africans? What's the way forward to us? And perhaps maybe Rowan would like to touch a little bit on that. Zipporah, if you can manage, please take the floor. Perhaps she's not in position. Rowan, would you like to share your thoughts on that? What if the West decides to shut access to finance? What's the way forward for Africa?
Yes, sure. I think if the West were to shut off access to finance for Africans, it would certainly pose significant challenges. However, it's important to note that international finance is a complex and interconnected system, and it's unlikely that such a complete or a unilateral shutdown would occur in practice. In fact,
perhaps she's not in position. Rowan, would you like to share your thoughts on that? What if the West decides to shut access to finance? What's the way forward for Africa?
Yes, sure. I think if the West were to shut off access to finance for Africans, it would certainly pose significant challenges. However, it's important to note that international finance is a complex and interconnected system, and it's unlikely that such a complete or a unilateral shutdown would occur in practice. In fact, but I can discuss some general strategies and alternative options that African nations or states can consider in such a scenario happened. First one, maybe strengthening regional cooperation. Maybe it will be the chance that the African states could strengthen the regional partnerships and cooperation within the continent itself by pooling resources and expertise. African countries can work together to develop regional financial mechanisms that provide us alternative sources of funding and investment. Maybe we can diversify our funding sources. African countries could explore alternative sources of finance beyond traditional Western channels. This could involve seeking investment and financial partnerships with the countries from other regions, such as Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, I guess. Additionally, African nations could focus on attracting investment from domestic sources and fostering entrepreneurship and local business, maybe small and medium and startups. It will maybe compensate the waste finance. Also, we can consider this an opportunity to promote our inter-African trade. I think it will be an advantage. African countries can boost intra-regional trade and economic integration by reducing trade barriers and promoting the exchange of goods and services within the continent. African countries also can develop stronger economic ties, enhance their export potential, and stimulate economic growth. Also, we can develop domestic financial systems, as I mentioned before, as our first questions were. Your first questions were about how to reform our domestic financial systems. African countries can focus on building robust domestic financial systems that are less depending on external financing. This includes developing local capital markets, strength banking sector, and promoting financial inclusion to ensure that a larger portion of population has the access to the financial services. I think it's these strategies maybe can compensate if these strategies I mentioned right now can help African nations to navigate challenges and reduce their dependence on external financing sources and fostering resilience and sustainable economic development if the West decided to complete shutdown of access to finance to Africa.
Thank you so much, Rowan, for touching on the multiple explorations on what Africa could actually do. I think that really shades some light into what should be happening currently, because most of these proposals from policy, from looking inward, in strengthening regional cooperation and strengthening trade and ties within the region. I think African countries have been trying to do that, and now we believe the question lies in leadership and governance, transparency. We're looking into accountability that really centers into the center of this conversation. And so I want to turn to Erasmus. Erasmus, now that we all agree that young people are the majority citizens on the continent, and we also agree that young people hold capability to really adapt technology, and they're actually concerned about how our governments function, how our economies function. So my question would be, in what ways can youth-led advocacy influence policy decisions and resource allocation at national and regional levels to prioritize sustainable development goals implementation? How can youth-led organizations promote transparency and accountability? Erasmus, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. Very good question. And I would also want to reiterate and say that in most of the African countries, there is adoption of the 2030 agenda. And we've always seen, I took time to actually engage and do a little bit of research in terms of these SDG secretariats and see how is their governance, how is the structure, and where do the youth actually come in to be the driving force for this. Much as the statistics show, we are the ones who are actually many in the continent. But at the same time, in terms of empowering us to really drive this agenda, we've always seen, I've seen it is something that is yet to peak. And if you permit me to use, it's a little bit off track. And in most of the secretariats, I think we need to agree that there's a need for us definitely to have the youth getting involved. If we are going to drive this agenda, the youth definitely have to be involved. The youth have to use such forums like the SDG secretariats and even up the national level to see how can we come up with the departments, how can we come up with associations, and can the national task forces with the regulatory arms, can they always consult these associations? And I'll give a small reference to Uganda. When the National Payment System Act was being revised and drafted, the Digital Frontiers Association, where I do belong, played a very key role in terms of the revision of the NPS Act. And this influenced in terms of the changes, in terms of what we needed to see. And our participation definitely was able to be appreciated. Now, if we could do the same even for the SDG Secretariat, and how can we ensure that the youth are playing a key role in terms of driving this? And I believe once we are able to integrate that into our flow, then it is something that we are able to realize and also ensure that they feel appreciated, they're participating in this, because we are the ones driving this. If you look at in terms of finance, the youth are driving the SDG goals, addressing the particular economic and social transformation. And I believe that we should be able to revise, onboard, integrate the youth into the secretariat and ensure that we are able to empower them to drive the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erasmus, for really sharing that with us. And I have a question from one of our listeners to Davis. The question comes that what do we pay back as Africans in compensation to the West contributions given to us as Africans? I mean, the idea of free money lunch, I don't think it's on the table. So perhaps, Davis, could you share what's the payback of Africans to, the financing coming in from the West?
Very interesting question, Ray. And I'm not sure if I'll give the user the answer that they're looking for. But I think it's important for us to also just set some context around contributions and financing into the continent. So I think there's one which talks about official development assistance that's given to member states or countries on the continent to fund, for example, things like budgetary gaps, all of those things. But then one could argue, for example, you also have things like concessionary finance, etc., that Africa benefits from, right? And so the argument is, well, how do we pay that back, etc. Now, for me, I think it's less about paying back than it is about, I think, just making sure that the monies that is then used is used appropriately. Because I think really when you consider, for example, just the topic around financing, ultimately, Africa pays back the contribution that we get from an ODA perspective many times over. And in fact, I recall it was President Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, at the recent Paris summit earlier this year, who advised that, it's really interesting how we are having a conversation about payback, etc., when actually the reality is there are a couple of things that we've got to appreciate from Africa. We've suffered from many, many years of colonialization. And if you go and you look at some of the contracts, for example, that we have negotiated over the last 60 years, many cases, it is actually that fare poorly, even though those are our resources, so the resources, etc., on the continent. So for me, if I was to say, who do we need to pay back? It's really about how do we make sure that we get young Africans to participate in, one, ensuring that we hold our governments accountable to the contribution that have been given to them, one. So, and that's also a way of ensuring that we meet the impact that, I guess, also states that have contributed to the continent expect from us. But I think it's also ensure that from a developmental perspective, we bring everyone on this journey and leave no one behind. And that for me is the essence of the SDGs and Agenda 2063. So I know I haven't really answered your question in terms of saying how do we pay back, because I actually believe as Africans we've paid 100-fold. But I think it's about how do we now use whatever it is that exists for those that come after us and for the young people like you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Davis, for your intervention. Now, I believe we have a couple of speakers on a queue who would like to intervene. If I'm correct, I think my colleagues will guide me. And perhaps I might want to share a stage to the speaker, Patience. Patience, do you have an intervention? Kindly utilize 1 minute, and you're very welcome to take the floor. Patience, over to you.
Thank you for opening up the floor to me. I just wanted to thank everyone who can before me and just state that I signed in as a speaker because when I signed in as a listener, I still couldn't hear. I put it in the comment section. But thank you for the conversation so far. I hope I can contribute to it later on.
Thank you, Patience. Thank you. I suppose that probably the same with Soon. Soon, do you have an intervention, or that was probably a typical technology challenge?
Good day, everyone. The same actually, same with Patience. When I signed in earlier as listener, I couldn't hear a thing, so I was forced to sign in as a speaker. And fortunately, I'm hearing. So hopefully, we'll be able to contribute as we go. But for now, no.
Thank you so much for really your flexibility to take on various measures to just be on this conversation with us. We really appreciate that, and then I think this really sets the kind of tone that African young people really follow a variety of developmental progresses. Now, I kindly recommend if you have any questions, comments, please do put that in the chat. We'll try as much as possible to really reach out to it and be sure it is able to be heard. With just about 15 minutes or so down the line, I want to hear briefly to our panelists, and I would want to just come back to Davis on a matter that Africa is resource rich and abundant, but underutilized natural resources. Now, what could resource rich countries in Africa do to capitalize the natural wealth while contributing to the green transition and sustainable development outcomes? We understand that different African countries and geographies has diverse of resources, natural resources. So, what could resource-rich countries do to capitalize? Really, Davis, over to you.
Thank you, Ray. This is a very interesting one, and I think it's one of the things that we talk about quite often. Because the reality is we always talk about how Africa is one of the richest continents in the world when it comes to natural wealth in all forms, whether it is minerals, whether it is forests, etc. And I think one of the things that really stand out as an opportunity is the AfCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and the associated developmental regional approach that has been advocated by the African Union. We know that the AFCFTA in itself as an agreement is not going to lift Africa out of poverty, but it is the associated benefits that result in a borderless Africa, etc. So therefore, what are the things that we can do practically to ensure that we capitalize on the natural wealth for contributing to this green transition and sustainable development? And actually, I want to go to a country that isn't as resource rich as we would think, but it talks to a point my previous call about institutions. Rwanda. If you look at Rwanda and its economic growth rate, one of the key reasons why Rwanda has been able to attract development is actually because of its ability to really make business easy. The government is efficient, the government works, the institutions work, and therefore the private sector is able to develop. Now, couple that with the AFCFTA, couple that with creating, for example, things like regional value chains, which we know, for example, as part of the AFCFTA, there are for those four value chains that are of key significance and focus. One of them, for example, is automation. And there are a couple of others. But I think for me, what's really clear is how do we as a continent actually work together, one, to ensure that entrepreneurs are able to develop goods and effectively sell those goods in markets that, for example, may not be sufficient, because we know that our own indigenous markets may not necessarily be sufficient for certain, for example, investments. But how do we leverage off the AFCFTA, and I think there's real opportunity there. And I think as part of the regional and as part of our commitment towards ensuring a just transition on the continent, taking into account that we as Africans are suffering disproportionately from climate change, it gives us opportunities for new industry. So, for example, why is it that, and I just happened to read this article recently, South Africa imported billions of dollars worth of solar panels, lithium, etc., from China and Europe within the last year, obviously because of the energy challenges that they are experiencing. Now, the question is, surely, as Africa, we could have created the own capacity to do those things. And so I'm encouraged by, for example, some of the stances by some of the African states to say, we are now going to ban the exportation of raw materials and actually consider value-added opportunities on the continent so that we can capture greater flows. I think a very good example was President Museveni when he talked about, for example, the chocolate industry and how Africa just does not participate. And a country like Belgium, which has no cocoa, benefits significantly from the sale of chocolate. So I think for me, it's really about calling on private sector, calling on government to ensure that we create, one, the mechanisms to encourage and promote entrepreneurship. Two, it is to call on African states to ratify and complete the process of their rules of origin, the free movement of people protocol, etc., to drive economic integration on the continent. And then it is to ensure that those benefits then become shared for all of us through various capacity building measures, etc. So I do think there's incredible opportunities. And if we allow also young entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs on the continent to thrive and we support them, they too offer innovative and sustainable solutions to achieving some of our social economic challenges on the continent. But I'm going to stop there, Ray. Thanks.
Appreciate it so much, Davis, for your contribution. I think that really resonates with the whole need to shift the paradigm. Opportunities are there, challenges are known. So it's just a matter of Africa to really decide that next step. Now, before I close our contribution, I just want to briefly touch on to bring this to Rowan and one. Just in a minute, if you were to to summarize or to share your closing, intervention to the conversation, shifting the paradigm, Africa's finance for sustainable development goals. What would you share in just under a minute? Rowan, over to you.
Thank you. In the financial paradigm, I think we can design innovative financing mechanism addressing weak domestic resource mobilization in Africa that will require a range of policy and institutional reforms aimed at increasing revenue collection, improving tax administration, reducing tax evasion and avoidance. Maybe also we can add strengthening public financial management by improving budget planning and execution, reducing waste and inefficiencies, and improving accountability and transparency in the use of public resources. I think we can underline the point of promoting private sector investment by creating an enabling environment that encourage private sector investment in the SDGs focused sectors such as renewable energy, water, education, and healthcare, among others. Can I add also some points about youth? Youth also can contribute to designing innovative financing mechanism by addressing the specific and priorities of African countries in their pursuit of SDGs in several ways. First, we can talk about collaboration. Youth can collaborate with other stakeholders such as governments, financial institutions, civil society, and the private sector to design innovative financing mechanisms that are tailored to the specific needs and the priorities for African continent. The pillar we can talk
Probably
Ray,
Yes, please.
can you
Kindly take the floor. Yes, I can hear you.
Can you please repeat the question, please?
So just to get your closing remark, your final pick up from this discussion in about a minute. What would you say about changing the paradigm for Africa's acceleration to achieving SDGs? In just about a minute, what would you say would be your takeaway?
Thank you. In the financial paradigm, I think we can design innovative financing mechanism addressing weak domestic resource mobilization in Africa that will require a range of policy and institutional reforms aimed at increasing revenue collection, improving tax administration, reducing tax evasion and avoidance. Maybe also we can add strengthening public financial management by improving budget planning and execution, reducing waste and inefficiencies, and improving accountability and transparency in the use of public resources. I think we can underline the point of promoting private sector investment by creating an enabling environment that encourage private sector investment in the SDGs focused sectors such as renewable energy, water, education, and healthcare, among others. Can I add also some points about youth? Youth also can contribute to designing innovative financing mechanism by addressing the specific and priorities of African countries in their pursuit of SDGs in several ways. First, we can talk about collaboration. Youth can collaborate with other stakeholders such as governments, financial institutions, civil society, and the private sector to design innovative financing mechanisms that are tailored to the specific needs and the priorities for African continent. The pillar we can talk about innovation. We can bring the youth innovative ideas and perspectives to the table and use technology and other tools to design financing mechanisms that are more inclusive, efficient, and effective. Finally, I think entrepreneurship We can utilize entrepreneurship factors can't achieve the progress of SDGs in Africa alone. We can add, or we have to add social and environmental concerns. Plus, we can also we can also call for the political stability and the political
Right.
will of Africa. Yes. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you so much for your remark. Now, cognizant of time, I want to turn on to Erasmus. A brief takeaway. Over to you, Erasmus. Dave, any takeaway briefly? Over to you.
Thanks, Ray. I think my takeaway certainly is, or at least my departing, and I do share the sentiments of the previous speakers. But I think for me, we're talking about young people in this, and I'm in Africa's Youth Voice. For me, it's really about how do we get more young people to actively participate in entrepreneurship. It is young people that will drive change on this continent. We, as a collective, and I say we, collectively across the continent, are responsible for driving Africa's growth. So how do we ensure that as young Africans, we support each other, one, to drive entrepreneurship and see us as active players in ensuring that we hold our governments and businesses accountable? Because in the last couple of years, we have seen the incredible power that young people have to mobilize resources and to mobilize people and to mobilize our continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Davis, for your comments. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all for tuning in. Just in a bit before you go, my colleague will be sharing a bit of an update on our coming conversations and dialogues across next week. I want to thank my colleagues, the panelists, Davis, Zipporah, Erasmus, and Rowan for making time to really share with us your impressions and experiences. And without further ado, I thank you all. I wish to turn on the floor to a co-organizer colleague, Rado or Lebo, to really share some closing updates. Thank you, colleagues, and over to the host.
Thank you very much to our moderator, Ray. Thank you so much also to our panelists for this very insightful conversation on ways in which we can shift the paradigm for finance for development in Africa. These developments are certainly very important for us because we all know that there's no solution without us, African youth. And to our dear listeners, we really apologize for the technical glitch that you experienced. We noticed that you also missed a good portion of the conversation, and we'll certainly look into it and see why this happened. But we would like to invite you to join us every Tuesday of September for more of these conversations. And coming up in the month of September, we have on the 12th of September, which is next week, Tuesday, energy and climate. We're going to be discussing Africa's readiness to manage trade-offs on climate. And then on the 19th of September, we have digitalization, focusing on unleashing Africa's growth through the Great Enabler. And then on the 26th of September, this one is a special edition, which is going to be in French. And it's going to be focused on people-centered policies, basically education, health, and the like. Once again, on behalf of the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, thank you so much. And let's connect next week, Tuesday at 8 a.m. New York time. Thank you all. Bye.